Thank you very much, and good morning. It's really wonderful to be invited here to Camden and also to a genuine opera house. This is an absolute first for me. So I'm a research associate at the Reuters Institute. Carries the Reuters name, but is actually, we're part of Oxford University. One of the things we do is we run fellowships for journalists from around the world who come and spend time with us in Oxford. But my role is more around the sort of pure research, which we do mainly into audiences and also into technology and to different aspects of journalism. And I suppose what marks us out from a lot of other institutes is that we try to be comparative and international in scope, as illustrated by what David just said around the scope of our main surveys. So I'm going to talk for around 30 minutes or so, and I'm going to try and focus on data that I think is going to cast light on some of the themes that this conference is trying to address. In particular, I'll set out how digital has disrupted news, not just here in the US, but around the world. I'll talk about changes to the business models, declining trust, the threat of online information, misinformation, but also about some of the positive side, some of the emerging opportunities that I think there are for publishers as we enter a new decade. And I'm going to draw on data from our digital news report. It's the largest ongoing news survey in the world. It's been going since 2012. Currently in 38 markets, and we're going to expand it this year to 40 markets. So here are the countries. So big focus on Europe and North America, but we also have good representation across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And there's quite a lot of variation in terms of internet penetration. So you can see some of the countries there with pretty much the entire population on the internet. But then in some other countries like Mexico and South Africa, the representation is a lot lower. So we need to bear that in mind when comparing between countries. We don't cover some authoritarian countries like China and Russia, for example, but just for your background, in some of those very big and important countries, internet penetration in Russia is around 75% now, China around 60%. And I should say at the start that this is based on online polling, so it will slightly underrepresent traditional news behavior such as television, print, and radio when we talk about cross-platform behavior in particular. So one of the benefits of running this kind of study where we ask the same questions every year is you can track changes over time. You can see those longer-term trends. And this is the story in the US in terms of the weekly reach of different sources of news over the last 7 years or so. And you can see a peak of interest around the 2016 election, the so-called Trump bump. But otherwise, this chart, I think, really shows the sort of structural changes that we've seen since 2013. So online reach, the blue line at the top, is still pretty flat, actually. But TV news starting to decline, significantly down in our data, driven by, in many cases, younger people abandoning television formats. The pink line, so that's print consumption, no surprise to many people in the room, halved or so in the last 5 years. And then the light blue line, we see this sort of really big increase between 2013 and 16 in terms of social media, and then leveling off. And this is really a pattern we see in many other countries, very similar in many other countries, but not everywhere. So I'm just going to show you Germany, and you can see that the lines are reversed. So television remains the single most important source of news, even with people who are online. But we can probably expect, if those trends continue, online to overtake television this year. Again, look at that fall in television, 10 percentage points in the last 7 years or so, and that's accelerating in many countries. And I think has huge implications, which we may want to talk about in Q&A. Again, print usage halved, social media slightly lower usage than in the US, but similar patterns, so rising to 2016, leveling off. So these are pretty significant shifts in just 7 years. But behind the averages, there's an even more interesting story, and this is illustrated by a question we ask every year about what your main source of news is. So what's your preferred way of accessing news? And we cut this by age. So this chart is an average of all 38 countries, but we see essentially the striking generational shift in terms of behavior. So under 35s are represented by the orange here, so that's 18 to 24s, and then by the light blue. And you can see that they significantly prefer online news sites and social media, whereas older groups over 55s essentially prefer the media they grew up with, so print or television news in particular. And the big shift is that younger people are not watching television news as much. I mentioned that in almost all countries, so 11 percentage point difference since 2013. And a third, so if you look at the orange there, a third of 18 to 24s, 36% now say that social media is their main source of news. And that compares with the same age group, 23% who say television. In the UK and the US, those generational splits are even more stark. So the other big shift that we've seen in the last 7 years, and here I'm using UK data, it's pretty similar in the US, is the way that within digital, the majority of news access is now from smartphones. So you can see the tipping point around 2017 in the UK. So 63% now use smartphone for news, and fewer people are using computer for news. That's not because people have fewer computers or laptops, it's just that this smartphone is so convenient, it's in your pocket all the time, and you can access anything, anytime. And I think this has enormous implications. Sometimes we don't really understand, I think, publishers don't understand the extent of this change and how it's going to play out. It has implications for the way we create the formats that work on the smaller device, the frequency of update that's required, and the business models too. So adjacent display advertising, which didn't really work on desktop, it's even less effective on small mobile screens. So it's affecting a lot of different things. So quick quiz. So think about where you got your first news this morning. So where did you have your first contact with news this morning? And so who in this room got their news from television? Put up your hands. First news from television. I'm seeing a few hands. I'm trying to look upstairs as well. Who got their, not many, who got their first news from radio this morning? David will be pleased. So a few more. Who got their first news from smartphone? Okay. So you do know you're not a representative sample, right? Again, these are UK figures, but pretty similar in the US. The smartphone is now the #1 way in which people get their news first in the morning. That wasn't the case when we asked this question in 2016, so that's changed. It's overtaken television. It was 16% 3 years ago. And for young people, it's just the default. So 54% say that the smartphone is the first way in which they access news. And in many cases, that will be scrolling through the lock screen or through social media. So with all this disruption, we've gone from a world where journalism used to be like this. It used to be a core part of everyone's routine. This is what a London commute looked like only a few years ago. There was a time for news. There was a time without distraction from entertainment or anything else. What does it look like today? Same carriage, completely different. What are people doing on these devices? Any ideas? Games, Candy Crush, Netflix. I see a lot of people looking at last night's television or watching Netflix. There is always something that's a bit easier than following the news, and it's instantly accessible on these mobile phones. So the real challenge is grabbing people's attention and keeping people's attention. And journalism is no longer just competing with other journalistic organizations, it's competing with entertainment in a really significant way. And I think that the difficulty of attracting attention for news has been one of the reasons why it's been so hard for publishers to attract advertising revenue over the last few years, and much of that has gone to as we've heard already, to the big online platforms. So in the last few years, we've seen a real shift towards different business models, different kinds of diversified business models, but particularly towards direct reader payment. So that may be asking people to subscribe directly to a news organization, it may be a membership or some kind of donation. Now, when we ask the question, have you paid for any online news in the last year, we find the US is really at the forefront of this, with 16% now saying they've paid for some online news in the last year or so. And that has grown significantly. And the big shift was in 2016, between 2016 and 2017. So that was the real jump from 9% to 16%. And a lot of that was driven by liberals, essentially, subscribing to the New York Times and the Washington Post as a way of holding Donald Trump to account. But we don't see quite the same levels in other countries, 9% in the UK. The real standout performer is Nordic countries, protected to some extent by language, smaller number of publishers, they have a bit more control in the market. 34%, a third of people in Norway are now subscribing to some, paying directly for online news, up 4% in the last year or so. And there is a substantial minority, I would say, who now recognize that you get what you pay for. So this move to payment is partly a reaction to clickbait journalism and partly because the publishers themselves have been starting to charge more for news. Even so, we find that most of this growth is confined to a relatively small number of publishers, suggesting that sort of winner takes most dynamics may be at play here. So these are FIP figures for digital-only subscription in the US. I think they're a little bit out of date. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal have just released new figures. But a recent poll from Business Insider shows that around half of all news subscriptions just go to these three big publishers. And back to our data, we find that people who subscribe tend to be better educated, probably from Maine, richer, more interested in news. In other words, everyone is chasing this relatively small pool of people. And more evidence of this comes when we look at the number of subscriptions, news subscriptions, that any individual is prepared to take out. And just to repeat, this includes ongoing payment to a news provider, but also whether you pay, whether somebody else pays, donations, all of that. Even then, we find the vast majority of people are still only prepared to pay for one brand. And this is true for richer people and more educated people too. And the competition is getting tougher. So, so many people have subscriptions also now to online providers like Netflix or entertainment services like Spotify. And although it's not a zero-sum game, I think this often comes into people's calculations about what they're prepared to subscribe to when they're looking at the end of the month about what they can afford. So one of the big challenges of getting people to pay for content is the power of intermediaries like Facebook and Google. I'm sure we're going to talk about this more later. So I was involved in starting the BBC News website 22 years ago, and then there was no Google, if you can imagine, no Google. There was no Facebook. How do people find things in those days? Can you remember? It's extraordinary, right? Books, Alta Vista, there was a search engine, right. Yeah, or there were magazines, actually, where you had to, which recommended things, and then you wrote it down and then typed that into a bookmark. So in those days, we had this sort of direct relationship, but that's really changed. So this is a chart which shows how people prefer to start their news journeys. And we can see, on average, across the 38 countries, 29%, so less than a third, now say they prefer to go directly to a website or app. And about a quarter are starting their journey with search, about the same with social media site like Facebook and Twitter, then 7% with a mobile alert, 6% with an aggregator like Apple News or Google News, and then 6% with email. So access to news is just much more complicated than it used to be. Around 3/4, 71%, are going through some kind of side door. And then if you add up the search, the social, and the aggregators, which use algorithms quite often to deliver news to people rather than editors, we find that around half of the news that people see, something like this, we think is selected for them now by computer rather than the journalist. Again, that's a really significant change. These are averages, and they hide very different country-level situations. We identified 4 models of online access, and this has a real impact on some of the issues like business models. So firstly, you have some of those Scandinavian countries I've mentioned already, represented here in this chart by Finland, where the majority of people, 64%, prefer to access directly. So these are strong news brands, they have strong connections with audiences, and you can see here that search and social have a much smaller influence. So very few people will use Google News in Finland, for example. And it's not really surprising that with that direct connection, they're able to deliver more subscriptions and better options for payment online. By contrast, we have a host of countries that can be characterized as mainly social. Many of these are in Latin America. In Chile, for example, more than 4 in 10 say they prefer to access news via social media, and just 19% say they prefer to go directly to a news brand. Then we have a number of countries we can characterize as pick and mix. I've included the US in this, and Canada and Ireland. So here you have some people, some of those loyalists who really identify with a news brand and are going directly, so around 27%. And then you have others within that often less interested in news who will use search or social media or some of these other methods. So it's a much more mixed model. And then this is a really interesting one, mainly in Asia, so a number of countries like Korea and Japan, where access is almost exclusively through big online portals or search engines. So in Japan, that will be Yahoo, which have a really dominant position. So most people are accessing through Yahoo. The brands are represented there. In Korea, it would be Naver and Daum. Only 4% in Korea say they prefer to go directly to a news website. So this obviously makes it much harder for those news brands in these deeply aggregated countries to form that direct relationship and therefore to charge for news. And so we're seeing very different models emerging there, such as licensing content to the platforms and payment for that. So some different models will apply in these different countries. So the other thing about platforms is that platforms are more powerful in some countries than others. They're also changing in terms of their role and influence in news, and not just in news. So this first chart looks at the weekly use of social platforms for any purpose, and this is averaged across 13 countries we've been tracking since 2014. So this includes the US. And there is, the first thing to note is there's a lot of talk about people coming off Facebook. We don't really see that in our data. So 64%, so pretty flat, say they're using Facebook for any purpose. Though people are definitely spending less time with Facebook. But look at how WhatsApp's grown, the green line there. So from around 17% to 45% in just a few years, and Instagram as well. So from 5% or so to 32%. And then for news, we see that Facebook has become, since 2016, slightly less important, partly because of their own strategies. So they've changed their algorithms. They're showing people, on average, a little bit less news in the feed. And this is making it harder. They've also made it harder to distribute organic news content. And again, you can see some of the sort of growing importance of WhatsApp and Snapchat and Instagram within news as well. And the move to private messaging, private groups, people sort of not wanting to share everything, and in many cases wanting to get away from those toxic conversations, and so going into these smaller groups where they feel they have more control. The other thing is the time spent with the young has really switched out of Facebook into some of these platforms, which really were designed from the ground up with the smartphone in mind. So it's much more visual. And they're really, you can see in this quote, I've really noted that Facebook was everything to me, but now, again, it's slightly different in slightly different countries. But this is really a real change that we're seeing around more visual networks. And then if we think about WhatsApp, which is a really interesting phenomenon because it's used so differently in different parts of the world. In the parts of the global south, it is now the main way socially in which people discuss and share news. So around, as you can see here, around 50% of people we sampled in these countries say that they use WhatsApp to discuss news, share news, find news. And in these countries, people are also likely to be in much bigger groups with people they don't know. And it's one of the reasons why WhatsApp has been used to spread, there's a lot of examples of this, to spread misinformation in countries like India and South Africa and Brazil. But it tends to be used very differently in countries like the US. So only 4% in the US say they're using WhatsApp for news. So it's much less important in the mix. And in terms of misinformation generally, perhaps it's no coincidence we find most concern in some of those countries like Brazil and South Africa. So more than 70% say that they are concerned about whether they can tell what is real and fake on the internet when it comes to news. And that's partly because it has been a real issue in recent elections. We also see high levels of concern in the UK, partly because of the increased polarization around Brexit, but also, false and misleading claims by high-profile politicians quite often spread in social media. Then, by contrast, you can see much lower levels of concern in countries like the Netherlands and Germany and Switzerland, where there has been less false information spread and fewer misleading statements by politicians too. More positively, and this speaks to some of David's opening comments, this concern does seem to be changing behavior online, and particularly with the young. So across countries, we find that more than a quarter, 26%, say that they now rely more on reputable sources than they did a year ago. And in the US, that's 40%. We left it up to the respondents to define what they mean by reputable. But here's Chloe, one of those we interviewed, a younger person, David, in the UK, talking about brands with a track record, like The Guardian and the BBC. And then 24% say they've stopped using sources with less accurate reputation. Again, 34% in the US. And again, here's a younger person saying it's changing my likelihood. And as with Josh, our next speaker, we find that the same is true of sharing news as well. Younger people are more likely to have changed their behavior. So this brings us to trust. And we find that trust in the news has been pretty consistently falling in a number of the biggest countries we've been looking at over the last 5 years. So even Finland, which has this incredibly high level of trust in institutions and journalism, trust is down 9 percentage points since 2013. In Germany, it's down 13 percentage points. You can see the impact of real-world events. So trust is linked to what's going on politically and to the increased polarization that we've seen in the UK, and some of that reflects on trust scores for the news. Partly as a result, in the last year, we've seen this real collapse of trust in France, down to 24%, and some of that relates to the Gilets jaunes protest. The media in France is seen as being essentially part of the elites, not representing ordinary people. And that's definitely reflected in some of those trust scores, has left gaps for organizations like Russia Today, for example. You'll notice that in the last chart, the US was pretty level in our data, but if you look beneath and you look at trust by political allegiance, you see an incredibly different story. So what you see is this amazing trust gap between people who self-identify on the left, that's represented by the blue. So when Trump was elected, trust levels went up in the media, 34% to 51%. Again, those are people investing in the liberal media as a way of holding Donald Trump to account. Whereas on the right, you can see trust continuing to collapse, perhaps fueled by Trump talking to the supporters about the media liberal media being fake news. And then at a brand level as well, you can see this people who self-identify on the left, this massive polarized gap, which we don't see in any other country. So people who self-identify on the left giving CNN a score of 7.4 out of 10. People who self-identify on the right essentially saying CNN is completely untrustworthy, and the other way around for Fox News. So the US, in many cases, we see similar trends in other countries, but not to the same extent. So politics plays a part in the actions of the media, but the media also bears some responsibility for the falling trust levels. In our data, 39% say the media often takes too negative a view of events. People think it often sensationalizes. It doesn't truthfully represent reality. 28% say they feel worn out by the amount of news these days. They can't get away from it. It's a ripple of acknowledgement there. And 32% say that they often or sometimes avoid the news. And when we ask them why, it's because it makes them feel depressed quite often, or they don't feel that they can do anything about these really long-standing, intractable issues. So I think partly in response to this, we are seeing the emergence on the positive side of new journalistic trends and new companies who are trying to get away from some of the noise and he said, she said. So in the UK, we have a company called Tortoise Media, which is part of the slow news movement. So they're trying to look at stories in more depth and avoiding some of those sort of immediate political stories. to correspondent, now here in the US as well. You'll also have constructive or solutions-based journalism, like BBC World Hacks, which tries to talk about stories where people can make a difference, where people are making a difference around the world. It's been hugely successful, and people fix the world. Podcasts is another example. You have explanatory approaches from Vox, the Indian Express, Aftenposten in Norway, really trying to explain the world better rather than being distracted by what's happening here and now or the tweets of a politician. So just finally, a few points about audio. I used to work in radio. I love audio. And this has suddenly become one of the hottest topics in media. And our own data shows that audio is now truly a worldwide phenomenon. 36% listen monthly to a podcast, 15% to a news one. And we've seen literally dozens of new podcasts starting in the last year, news ones, daily news ones in the English language. This is now spreading to other languages. Usage is driven by younger people, so they listen proportionately, under 35s listen proportionally 4 times as much as over 55s. And the reason, again, is that smartphone aligned to headphones. So this is the plugged-in generation. It's taken away a lot of the friction to finding great audio content, allied with the fact there's now a lot more creative content out there for people to listen to. And when we ask people young people why they're listening to podcasts, obviously they mention multitasking. Audio has always been great for multitasking, but it's the sort of the frictionless ease with which linear programming and linear audio is working. You just let it wash over you. It's very easy. You sit back. Secondly, digital natives really like that idea of control. They don't want somebody to schedule what they want to listen to, and podcasts give them that opportunity to choose their own content. And finally, podcasts are different from radio. They are less stuffy. They're more diverse, a huge, diverse range of ideas on offer as well. And I think, many people ask me, so is the audio trend over? Have we reached peak podcasts? I don't think so. I think a number of trends are really going to push audio much further over the next few years. So I think better headphones, so these noise-canceling pods are the latest thing. If you look since Christmas in London, just got all these people are sprouting white things out of their ears. I don't see so many of those in Maine. I think it's going to be the big hit of the year. Voice-activated speakers and assistants, so in our data, doubling year on year, though, not really being used currently for news, but even so, these audio devices are going into people's homes in their millions. That will have an effect eventually. And also starting to push into cars. And I think we're going to see a real... we've seen disruption of print. We're now moving into an era of disruption of linear television and radio as well, with new possibilities as well. So what does all this amount to? So I think we've talked about online significantly changing and fragmenting consumption. So offering lots of positives, more speed, more choice, but at the same time bringing us more unreliable news in many cases, leading to or contributing to a decline in trust, and critically to disruptive business models, though, as I've mentioned already, more in some countries than in others. And in response, we're seeing this sort of shift away from advertising models, or certainly towards more diversification in terms of revenue, and towards different kinds of reader payment. But it's not going to work for all, and I think there is no one-size-fits-all around how we solve the business questions. Trust in the media continues to fall in many countries. It's partly because of the behavior of populist politicians, but it's also undermined by the media's own actions over many years, including clickbait, sensationalized reporting, and negative coverage, and it remains a really significant issue. Fears about misinformation continues to rise, but the threat is changing all the time. It won't be the same in the 2020 US election as it was in 2016. It's going to be different. And we're also seeing this sort of move from open social networks like Facebook to more usage and sharing of information in private groups and private messaging apps, and that's going to have an impact too. And then finally, we're seeing some shifts in formats, again, driven by the devices people are using, so visual journalism for sure, but also I think audio is going to be a really significant opportunity for publishers, driven by easier access, the popularity of news podcasts and new devices like smart speakers. So hopefully just some data there to help set the scene for some of the contributions that are coming up in the discussion. All of our reports, by the way, from the Reuters Institute are free to download and available from our website. Just pop it into Google or your favorite search engine. Thank you very much.
Nic Newman, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.